What if the most powerful healing doesn't happen in a therapist's office, in a self-help book, or even in the broad daylight of your conscious mind, but instead in the final quiet moments before sleep, when the veil between your ego and your soul is thinnest? Carl Jung believed that this twilight moment, those last 30 seconds before you drift into unconsciousness, is a sacred threshold, a mystical gateway to the deeper layers of the psyche. It is here, in this unguarded space between waking and dreaming, that transformation can begin, not through analysis or striving, but through a simple whisper that reaches beyond the intellect and speaks directly to the soul. 7 words: I accept all of myself right now. Spoken gently just before sleep, these words do more than soothe. They serve as a symbolic key, unlocking the hidden corridors of your subconscious and inviting your rejected parts, the wounded child, the silent shadow, the buried emotion, to return home. Jung understood that the unconscious mind is not a passive storage of memories, but a living landscape of symbols and stories, and when you speak to it in its own language, ritual, feeling, repetition, you begin to rewrite the inner myth you've unknowingly lived by. This article explores how these 7 words, used as a nightly ritual, can begin to repair the fractured relationship you have with yourself, not by fixing who you are, but by embracing the very parts you've been taught to hide. By whispering this phrase, you begin to integrate your shadow, dissolve inner resistance, and step into the quiet power of wholeness. Over time, this small act can calm emotional turbulence, soften the inner critic, and realign your identity, not around shame, but around acceptance. As Jung once said, you don't have to become someone else, you just have to stop rejecting yourself. This is not about auto-suggestion or feel-good affirmations. It is a sacred psychological ritual, one that reflects a deeper truth. Healing begins when we stop turning away from ourselves and start listening, even in the silence of night. The first, why the last words before sleep matter. Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is not mere poetry. It is a fundamental insight into how our inner world shapes the outer one. And nowhere is this truth more profoundly activated than in the silent, liminal moment before we surrender to sleep. This brief threshold, when your body softens, your breath slows, and your mind begins to loosen its grip on the waking world, is what Jung called a liminal space, a symbolic passage between dimensions of the self. Your ego, with all its daily roles, worker, partner, parent, performer, begins to dissolve. And in that dissolution, the gate to the unconscious swings open. This moment is sacred, not in a religious sense, but in a deeply psychological one. What you whisper to yourself here is not dismissed into the void. It is received. It is heard by the unconscious, that vast, symbolic realm of buried memories, forgotten feelings, and archetypal forces. If you say, I am unworthy, your psyche does not debate, it begins to reshape your inner myth around that belief. But if you say, I am whole, the psyche responds in kind. It shifts. It begins to listen differently, to reorganize itself around that new symbolic instruction. Jung believed that words spoken at the edge of sleep are not mere sounds. They are psychic tools, symbols encoded with power. Words carry energy. They awaken archetypes. They communicate with the parts of you that do not speak in language but in image, emotion, and dream. In this vulnerable moment, the unconscious is open, receptive, sensitive, and hungry for meaning. As the ego sleeps, the psyche does not. It works. It processes, resolves, creates. Dreams emerge, not randomly, but as reflections of the soul's attempt to heal, to integrate, to awaken. The words you speak before sleep are not commands, but sacred invitations. They set the tone for your inner work through the night. If you feed the unconscious fear, guilt, or self-loathing, it responds with unrest, through dreams, fatigue, or spiritual heaviness. But if you offer it symbols of peace, forgiveness, and acceptance, it begins a different kind of alchemy, a reintegration of what has long been exiled from consciousness. This is not wishful thinking. Neuroscience now confirms what Jung observed decades ago. the brain is most suggestible in the moments before sleep. Neural pathways formed during this twilight state tend to hold. Words spoken here leave fingerprints on the psyche. Jung also taught that archetypes, those deep psychological patterns that live in all of us, can be awakened through words. A phrase like, "I forgive," can summon the wounded healer. "I accept," can call the shadow to step into the light. "I am enough," can bring forth the inner child long buried beneath shame and silence. These are not just affirmations, they are rituals of reconnection, invitations to forgotten parts of the self to come home. Yet today, we often treat bedtime as a throwaway ritual, a final scroll through our phone, a flick of the light. But Jung would urge us to see it differently. As a portal, as a moment of reverence, a chance to sow symbolic seeds into the fertile soil of the unconscious. Because tomorrow's emotional landscape begins with tonight's inner dialogue, so ask yourself, what if your final words before sleep were intentional? What if they reflected not your wounds, but your wholeness? The 7 words we will explore in the next section, "I accept all of myself right now," are not random. They are drawn from Jungian principles. Each one touches a different layer of the psyche. Each one calls back a part of you that has been lost in the shadows. This is not theory alone. Jung saw it in his patients. He felt it in his dreams. He witnessed it in the quiet transformation that begins when a single phrase is spoken with sincerity, in the dark, where the soul listens. So tonight, do not let your last thoughts be shaped by fear or forgetfulness. Speak with intention. Speak with reverence. Speak in a way that invites your soul to come home. The second, what are the 7 words that can change everything? Carl Jung never handed us a script of 7 magic words. He did not offer bedtime formulas or surface-level affirmations. But through the depth of his work, his writings on the unconscious, on archetypes, on the shadow and the journey of individuation, he gave us a framework. And within that framework we can distill a powerful phrase that aligns with the very heart of his psychology. "I accept all of myself right now." 7 simple words. Soft, unassuming, yet each syllable holds the weight of an entire philosophy. This is not a sentence. It is a ritual, a symbolic act of union between your conscious self and your hidden depths. Let us enter it the Jungian way, word by word, each one a doorway. I. This is the anchor, the root of awareness. In Jungian terms, the I is not just the ego, but the spark of presence that claims responsibility. It is the moment the conscious self steps forward and says, "This is mine." No projection, no blame, just sovereignty. To begin with I is to declare, "This is my work, my pain, my healing." The unconscious listens differently when it knows the message is personal. Accept. Jung viewed acceptance not as weakness, nor as indulgence, but as the gateway to transformation. To accept is not to condone, but to see without distortion. To gaze directly at what we've hidden or feared, our wounds, our darkness, our unmet needs, and say, "I will not turn away." When you say accept before sleep, it is as though you are whispering to the shadow, "I see you, I no longer deny you." Let's begin. All. Perhaps the most radical word in the phrase. Not some, not the lovable parts, not the pieces that perform well in the daylight. All. Jung taught that wholeness is not found through selective healing. It requires the integration of opposites. The divine and the damaged, the noble and the broken, the light and the dark. When you say all, you are no longer editing your soul, you are gathering it. Of. A small word, but powerful. Of implies ownership. Everything that lives within your psychic field is yours. Your fears, your dreams, your grief, your instincts. Jung taught that the more we take responsibility for what is within, the less we are driven by it unconsciously. Of dissolves projection, and projection, Jung warned, is the root of most suffering. Myself. This word opens the door to the greater self, not just the ego, but the totality of who you are. Jung believed the self is the archetypal whole, the internal source of meaning, the one who watches your life unfold from within. To say myself is to reach beyond identity and speak to the mythic center, the inner healer, the silent witness, the soul. Right. This is the word that bends time. The ego lives in now, the unconscious in timelessness. Right creates a bridge. It does not postpone healing or defer worthiness to tomorrow. It calls it forth in this breath. It declares, this is the moment. The psyche responds not to delay, but to immediacy. Now, the final word, the seal. Now ends the loop of waiting and completes the invocation. The unconscious does not respond to vague promises or future intentions. It responds to truth spoken in the present. Now is not just a point in time, it is the opening through which the soul hears, the place where healing begins. Now is what transforms a phrase into a ritual. So when you speak these 7 words, I accept all of myself right now, you are not simply reciting, you are performing a sacred act of integration, you are calling the shadow home from exile, you are activating archetypes that have waited in silence. You are aligning ego and unconscious, inviting the psyche to shift, and you are doing it at the most receptive moment, in that liminal, symbolic space before sleep, when the conscious mind dissolves and the deeper self begins to listen. You are not commanding the unconscious, you are honoring it. You are not begging for healing, you are partnering with it. And this, Jung would say, is the key distinction between hollow affirmations and deep psychological transformation. Jung never believed that words alone could save the soul, but he knew that truth, spoken with presence, spoken with reverence, could begin the return to self, the return to wholeness, the return to peace. The third, shadow integration, begins in the night. Carl Jung often described the unconscious as a vast inner kingdom, mysterious, powerful, and largely unknown to the waking self. And at the heart of this kingdom lies the shadow, the parts of us we have repressed, denied, or judged as unworthy. These are not simply flaws, they are exiled truths, forgotten voices, sacred fragments of our wholeness waiting to be reclaimed. For Jung, confronting the shadow was not optional, it was essential, and few moments offer as potent an invitation to that confrontation as the minutes before sleep. This is when the ego loosens its grip, the mind softens, and the soul becomes most receptive to what it has long avoided. When you speak the words, I accept all of myself right now, before sleep, you are not performing a passive affirmation. You are extending a hand to the shadow, saying, I see you. I will no longer pretend I am only the parts that win approval in the daylight. This gesture is not one of force, but of presence. Shadow integration does not begin with discipline. It begins with humility, with acknowledgement, with invitation. And the unconscious does not respond to demand, it responds to sincerity. As we sleep, the mind does not vanish, it transforms. The ego rests, but the unconscious awakens. It processes emotions, resolves inner conflict, and begins the sacred process Jung called individuation, the journey toward becoming a whole, integrated human being. When the final words you whisper before sleep embody acceptance, something within you shifts. Your unconscious receives the message. There is no longer a war within. The parts of you that were rejected, the rage, the grief, the forgotten dreams, no longer need to remain hidden. And when they begin to emerge, they often do so through dreams. Jung saw dreams not as random static, but as symbolic communications from the soul. He called them a spontaneous self-portrayal, in symbolic form, of the actual situation in the unconscious. If you fall asleep with resistance or avoidance, your dreams may become chaotic, disjointed, even violent, mirroring the inner fragmentation. But if you enter sleep with conscious acceptance, your dreams begin to reflect coherence. You may encounter recurring symbols, a child lost in a crowd, a locked room, a dark figure at the edge of your awareness. These are not just dreams, these are living aspects of your psyche seeking return, and that return is the beginning of healing. Integration is not about eliminating the shadow, nor about cleansing yourself of the bad. Jung warned against moralistic purification. He knew that the shadow does not contain only darkness, it contains gold. Strengths, desires, talents and passions we suppressed to survive. The peacemaker who denied their anger may find in it a newfound fire for truth and boundaries. The sensitive soul who buried their vulnerability may rediscover deep wells of empathy and emotional intelligence. This is the alchemy of the psyche. Not self-improvement, but self-remembrance. Not becoming someone else, but finally reclaiming who you've always been. And this sacred process begins when the world grows quiet. Before sleep, the walls that protect the ego begin to fall. Rationalization, denial, suppression, they go offline. And in that softness, the unconscious becomes malleable. It begins to listen with openness, reorganizing itself around the words it receives. When you speak those 7 words, softly, truthfully, you're not just offering a thought, you're sending a signal, a message that the war is over, that it is safe to come home. Some nights you may dream vividly, other nights you may feel nothing at all. But the work is happening, beneath awareness, beneath effort. Each repetition of this ritual waters the soil of the soul. Each whisper builds a bridge. From the ego to the self, from the conscious mind to the dream world, from exile to integration. And over time you will feel it. The dreams become clearer. Your reactions during the day lose their edge. The inner critic softens its grip. You begin to see patterns. You begin to feel more whole. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, like the horizon softening before dawn, you begin to wake up differently. Not with fireworks, but with presence. Not with perfection, but with peace. You are becoming real. You are becoming whole. The 4th, rewriting the subconscious narrative. Carl Jung believed that long before we consciously choose our lives, we are already living out a story, a myth scripted not by reason or intention, but by the unconscious. This myth is not false in the way modern minds define a myth. It is symbolic truth, an inner architecture of meaning that shapes how we perceive ourselves, what we believe we deserve, how we relate to love, pain, success, and even to time itself. Most people never read the script. They confuse its repetition with fate, but what they're really living is programming. A composite of unresolved wounds, forgotten memories, repressed fears, and unlived archetypes stored deep within the unconscious. This is the invisible narrative that Jung warned us about, not as a doom, but as an invitation. Because this myth, though deeply rooted, can be rewritten, not by force, not by logic, and not by reciting surface-level affirmations. The unconscious doesn't respond to control, it responds to symbol, to sincerity, to repeated ritual gestures that speak its native language. That is what the 7 words, "I accept all of myself right now," become when spoken before sleep. A gentle yet powerful interruption of the old story, a symbolic statement that reclaims authorship from shame and returns it to wholeness. Each time you speak these words, you plant a seed, a micro-intervention into the myth you've lived by. You are not just saying something kind, you are reshaping your psychic architecture from the inside out. The unconscious begins to listen, not to your goals or ambitions, but to your sincerity. Over time, it begins to restructure your symbolic reality. You may find yourself speaking more gently to yourself in daylight. You may interrupt the reflex to self-criticize. You may notice that the voice within, the one that once demanded perfection or hid in self-hatred, begins to soften. You might start to dream differently. A parent who once abandoned you may embrace you. A predator may stop chasing and begin speaking. A locked door may creak open. These are not just dreams. They are messages from the soul that your inner story is evolving. That what was once fractured is now being acknowledged. That you are no longer an enemy to yourself. And once the unconscious receives that message consistently, night after night, it begins to rewire your emotional habits. The old anxieties lose their grip, the reactivity fades, a deeper stillness emerges. You no longer live from, "I must hide who I am," but from, I am allowed to be whole. And while others may not see this shift immediately, it is foundational. It is the quiet turning point that shapes every future decision, every boundary you set, every act of creation, intimacy, and courage. Jung taught that true transformation does not come through punishment or shame. It comes through what he called self-standing, the moment you stop running from your story and begin listening, not with judgment, but with compassion. You reclaim your authority from within. That's why these 7 words matter. They are not motivational fluff. They are ritual language, words that speak to the unconscious in its own dialect. Symbol, timing, sincerity, repetition. You do not need to unearth every childhood wound before you begin to heal. You do not need to decode every trauma before you are allowed peace. You only need to relate to yourself differently, especially in the moments that matter most, like the final breath before sleep, when the gates of the unconscious are open. And in that moment, when you whisper, "I accept all of myself right now," your psyche receives the message. It's safe. The war is over. You no longer have to protect me from myself. This is how you begin to rewrite the myth. Not by forgetting what hurt you, but by integrating it. Not by rejecting the shadow, but by inviting it home. And each time you do, your inner narrative changes. Slowly, symbolically, truthfully. You are no longer the wounded child repeating the past. You are the conscious adult remembering the truth. You were always whole. Now you are becoming aware of it. The 5th, emotional alchemy, while you sleep. Carl Jung viewed the human psyche not as a machine to be fixed, but as an alchemical vessel, a sacred furnace where the base elements of our emotional life could be transmuted into self-awareness, inner strength, and wholeness. Not in the literal sense of fire and metal, but in the symbolic sense. A place where sorrow becomes wisdom, where rage becomes clarity, and where darkness becomes light, not by erasing it, but by embracing it. Jung believed that our wounds, our shadow, our unprocessed emotional pain were not obstacles to our growth, but the very raw materials of transformation. This process, what he called psychological alchemy, doesn't require performance or perfection. It requires presence. And it often begins not in the therapy room or the journal page, but in the quietest hours of the night. When you whisper the 7 words, "I accept all of myself right now," before sleep, you are not soothing yourself, you are igniting a process. A subtle but profound initiation inside the unconscious. That one sentence is more than affirmation. It is symbolic fire introduced into the psyche's hidden chamber. It brings the light of awareness into the parts of you long buried in shadow. The anger, the fear, the grief, the unmet needs. They sit heavy in the soul like psychic lead. But Jung, like the ancient alchemists before him, saw lead not as waste, but as potential. Lead is dense with possibility. It is the material that transforms, if you are willing to hold it with compassion instead of judgment. And sleep is the sacred container. During the day, we are distracted, we wear masks, we live from the ego, but at night, the armor drops, the unconscious emerges, and it begins working with whatever you've offered it. If you fall asleep flooded with resentment, avoidance, or self-hatred, that material is taken in like fuel, burned into restless dreams, subtle anxiety, and emotional fatigue. But when the offering is acceptance, the chemistry changes. Fear begins to soften into awareness. Rage begins to reveal its roots in protection. Shame begins to dissolve into empathy. This is emotional alchemy. It does not erupt like fireworks. It whispers, it reshapes, it restores from within. You may not awaken with divine visions or perfect clarity, but you may notice a subtle shift. Your inner voice grows kinder, your reactions slow, your emotions feel safer to feel. The storm inside you begins to rest. This change is not random. It is the fruit of ritualized presence. The unconscious does not shift through willpower. It shifts through symbol, sincerity, and repetition. The 7 words become a nightly offering, an internal peace treaty. Jung knew that emotions are not fixed traits, but living patterns of energy. They move, they evolve, and yes, they can transform. By offering self-acceptance before sleep, you are not suppressing the dark. You are inviting it to unfold safely. You are signaling to your unconscious, you no longer need to protect me from myself. This is where true healing begins. Not with force, but with willingness. Not with answers, but with openness. And willingness is everything. Jung taught that what you resist not only persists, but grows stronger. The path to peace is not control, it is surrender. It is the courage to feel what you've avoided, and to trust that your psyche knows how to metabolize what you've carried for too long. The 7 words are not magic. They are a threshold, a doorway through which the soul begins to breathe again. Each time you speak them, you soften the wall between you and your emotions. You create space for your inner healer, the self, to emerge. You do not need to dissect every feeling to transmute it. You simply need to stop rejecting it. That's what these words do. They are the gentle flame that warms the alchemical vessel. They say to your psyche, you are safe now. You are heard. You are allowed to change. And in that sacred invitation, the healing begins. The 6th. Jung's clients and the power of night rituals. Carl Jung was not merely a philosopher of the psyche. He was a physician of the soul, a clinician who spent decades working directly with patients from all walks of life: artists, soldiers, scientists, mothers, scholars, and seekers. His consulting room in Küsnacht, Switzerland, became a sanctuary for those carrying unspoken burdens, individuals not merely seeking analysis, but transformation. And for many, that transformation did not begin with interpretation or intellect. It began with ritual, with quiet, symbolic acts that spoke not to the conscious mind, but to the unconscious self, the part of us that listens in symbols, not logic. Jung understood something radical for his time, that the unconscious does not respond to persuasion, but to presence, not to reasoning, but to symbolic sincerity. And he considered the final moments before sleep a threshold of immense psychological power. When the ego softens and the unconscious stirs, a window opens, a sacred liminal space where the soul becomes most impressionable. It is here that the right words, spoken with truth, can begin to reshape the inner world. Consider one of Jung's patients, a successful man in his mid-40s, outwardly accomplished, inwardly drowning. He suffered from recurring dreams of suffocation and anxiety that no achievement could silence. Jung recognized what the man could not. He had become trapped inside his persona, the social mask polished for survival but barren of feeling. His deeper self, vulnerable, fearful, alive, had been exiled. Jung offered not an interpretation, but a nightly ritual. Before sleep, the man was to place his hand on his chest and speak 7 words. I allow myself to feel what is inside me. At first, the man scoffed. It felt childish, unnecessary, but night after night, he obeyed the ritual. And slowly, his dreams began to change. The drowning stopped. Water became a source of rebirth. He dreamed of surfacing, of breathing freely. He began to weep again after decades of emotional stillness. This was not coincidence. It was integration. The unconscious had received an invitation and responded with return. Now the patient, a woman burdened by nightmares of being chased. In waking life, she was competent, in control, admired, but in the world of dreams, a shadow followed her, wild, afraid, unspoken. Through dialogue, Jung helped her uncover what had been long denied, the part of her that felt small, soft, overwhelmed. He invited her to whisper before sleep. I accept the part of me that is afraid. She resisted, but within days her dreams shifted. The shadow no longer hunted her. It cried, it spoke, it embraced her. The monster was not an enemy. It was a forgotten part of herself, seeking welcome. This is the symbolic power of nighttime ritual. Not magic, not suggestion, but reconciliation. The moment you stop rejecting something within, it no longer needs to scream for your attention. Jung believed that healing happens not through forceful extraction, but through integration, bringing the disowned, the shadowed, and the silenced into conscious relationship. And for Jung, ritual was a sacred tool for this work. Not religious ritual, but intentional acts that express a psychological truth. The hour before sleep, when the ego yields, is the ideal terrain for such acts. What we now call mantras or affirmations, Jung understood as sacred symbolic offerings, not to manipulate reality, but to speak to parts of the self long exiled in silence. Another example, a teenage boy haunted by nightly panic attacks. Underneath his anxiety lay a deeper wound, shame around his sensitivity, instilled by a father who mocked emotion. Jung gave him one sentence, "I am allowed to be soft." The boy laughed. But 3 weeks later, the panic was gone. The unconscious had received a different myth. You no longer have to hide who you are. In every one of these stories, we see a common pattern. Suffering does not arise only from outer events, but from an inner war, between the parts we accept and the parts we reject. By speaking new symbolic truths before sleep, these patients were not performing magic. They were initiating peace. They were telling the psyche, "You are welcome here." This is the deep psychological power behind the 7 words, "I accept all of myself right now," not because they are clever, not because they are popular, but because they reflect a Jungian principle as ancient as myth itself. Healing begins when the exile ends. When what has been cast out is brought back into wholeness. These rituals, small as they seem, are not insignificant. In the language of the unconscious, they are seismic. They declare readiness. And the unconscious, like nature itself, always responds to readiness. The 7th, how to practice the 7-word ritual each night. Up until now, we have journeyed through the symbolic terrain. Why the moment before sleep is sacred, how Jung viewed the unconscious as a living, mythic realm, and how language, when offered with sincerity, becomes a bridge between the conscious and the shadow. But insight, as Jung reminded us, is never enough on its own. Knowing is not sufficient. We must apply. Willing is not enough. We must do. Without embodiment, even the deepest truth fades into abstraction. What matters is ritual, an act of devotion, repeated not for outcome, but for connection. So how do you bring this sacred phrase, "I accept all of myself right now," into nightly practice? It begins with a decision, not to perform, not to impress, but to make space for yourself. Not just to put the body to sleep, but to awaken the psyche to presence. Step 1. Create a quiet moment. Set aside 2 to 5 minutes each night before bed. Turn off the digital noise, dim the lights, let silence enter. You are not just falling asleep, you are stepping through a psychological doorway. Jung believed that the unconscious emerges more clearly in stillness, when it is no longer drowned by distraction. The darkness, the quiet, the slowing of breath, all create fertile ground for symbolic material to rise. Step 2. Speak slowly. Speak honestly. Say the 7 words out loud or silently, but let them be spoken with your whole presence. I accept all of myself right now. Do not rush. Do not repeat them like an incantation. Let each word descend like a stone dropped into still water. If a word catches, accept, myself, all. Pause. Feel that resistance. Stay with it. That is the shadow showing itself. Not as enemy, but as invitation. Step 3. Personalize the ritual, optional. While Jung would affirm the power of these exact words, he also knew that ritual must feel authentic to the inner landscape. You may adapt your phrase slightly. I allow myself to feel everything tonight. I forgive the parts I once feared. I welcome home what I rejected. What matters is not poetic perfection, but emotional sincerity. These are not affirmations in the superficial sense. They are symbolic signals to the unconscious. You no longer need to hide from me. Step 4. Add a somatic gesture. Jung was deeply attuned to the body's role in psychic life. The soma as a mirror of the soul. Placing a hand on your heart, resting your palm on your belly, or lying down with intention can root the ritual in the body. Over time, your body will begin to associate this posture with safety, openness, and release. The unconscious listens not only through words, but through rhythm, gesture, and breath. Step 5. Journal your dreams. Jung called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. If you speak these words before sleep, expect your dream life to become more vivid, symbolic, and emotionally layered. Upon waking, write down what you remember. An image, a symbol, a tone. Don't rush to interpret. Collect. Over time, you may see patterns, recurring places, forgotten figures, archetypal symbols. These are messages, reflections of your evolving psychic myth, and if you feel called, ask Jungian dream prompts. What part of me does this dream represent? What is this image asking me to face or feel? What would change if I welcomed this figure instead of resisting it? Step 6. Trust the slowness. This is not a quick fix. Jung knew that the psyche unfolds in spirals, not straight lines. Transformation is slow because it must be real. You may not feel anything after one night, but over weeks and months, a quiet trust begins to build. The wounded parts of you, the orphaned emotions, the forgotten instincts begin to emerge, not all at once, and not always gently, but steadily, because they finally believe they will be met with compassion, not exile. Step 7. Stay through resistance. There will be nights when you resist, when you're tired, when the words feel hollow or silly. That's when the ritual matters most, because it is in those very moments, when you least want to be present, that presence becomes most powerful. Saying the words when it's hard is how you show the unconscious, I am no longer ruled by avoidance. I can sit with myself, even here. Jung called this holding the tension of the opposites. The sacred ability to stand between light and dark, hope and doubt, joy and grief, without collapsing or fleeing. That is strength. That is integration. And that is how these 7 words become more than a bedtime habit. They become a threshold, a bridge between the fragmented self and the whole self, a nightly offering, a quiet revolution, a whisper to the soul, you are safe, you are seen, you are welcome home. The 8th, living from wholeness, the lasting echo of a nightly ritual. Carl Jung often reminded us that the true goal of psychotherapy is not happiness, not success, not even stability, but wholeness. In his words, wholeness is the state in which all aspects of the self, light and shadow, ego and soul, conscious and unconscious, are no longer at odds, but seen, welcomed, and gradually integrated. It is not about becoming perfect. It is about no longer needing to split yourself in two to survive. It is the quiet end of an inner war, a reconciliation. When you begin the sacred practice of saying, I accept all of myself right now, just before sleep, you are not merely soothing your nervous system or influencing your dreams. You are planting a seed in the soil of the psyche. And as Jung knew, what we offer to the unconscious with sincerity does not vanish. It germinates. Slowly, invisibly, it roots itself into your way of being. This is the essence of individuation, not the adding of more identities or roles, but the peeling away of illusion, the shedding of masks, until what remains is real. The self. That emergence is not loud. It does not come through epiphany or applause. It comes through small, consistent acts of presence. You will begin to notice a pause before reacting, a softness where once there was defense, an old voice of inner criticism rising, and this time you don't believe it. You feel sadness and you no longer run. You feel joy and you let it land. These are not random shifts. They are signs that your soul has begun to trust you again, that the parts you once rejected are beginning to return. And as your inner world reshapes, so too does your outer life. Relationships shift. You no longer chase validation because you've stopped invalidating yourself. You attract honesty because you have stopped lying to your own emotions. You make space for truth because you no longer abandon your own. You don't need to prove your worth because you've remembered it. This is not miracle. It is the natural unfolding of psychic integration. Jung understood that whatever we exile within ourselves returns in outer form, appearing as fate, as struggle, as repetition. But once reclaimed, fate becomes freedom. You stop reacting to life blindly. You begin engaging with it consciously, not from fragmentation, but from centeredness, not from fear, but from soul. And this is the quiet power of the 7-word ritual. Its beauty is not only in what it offers while you sleep, but in how it changes the way you awaken. You rise rooted, no longer scattered across forgotten parts of yourself. You feel aligned, not because life is perfect, but because you are no longer divided. You carry a quiet clarity into the day, and in that clarity there is strength. In that strength there is compassion, and in that compassion there is a life you no longer need to escape from. This is the echo of ritual. It lingers beyond the night. It begins to live in your decisions, your boundaries, your presence, your love. You begin responding to others, not from a wound, but from an overflow. The gift of a heart that finally feels safe within itself. You begin to live the words, not just whisper them. You begin to embody wholeness. Carl Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That journey does not begin with a loud transformation. It begins with a whisper, a small moment, a soft sentence before sleep, a willingness to meet yourself with truth. I accept all of myself right now. Say it tonight, not for the outcome, but for the offering. The psyche is listening, and the soul remembers the sound of home. If something within this message stirred you, if even a single word mirrored your inner experience, I invite you to let your voice be heard in the comments. Have you encountered that soul whose presence feels like home, or are you still walking the sacred path back to yourself? Your story, however unfinished, may become the lantern in someone else's darkness, the very sign they didn't know they were searching for. And if someone close to you is silently struggling with the illusion that love must hurt, that self-abandonment is the price of connection, or that they are unworthy of peace, share this video with them. Help me reach the ones who need to remember. Real love does not demand that we shrink. True connection does not ask for sacrifice of the soul. And the most vital union we will ever form is the one with our own inner truth. Before you go, I invite you to subscribe and activate the notification bell. Here, in this space, we journey beneath the surface of things, exploring the hidden architecture of the psyche, the whispers of the unconscious, and how every relationship is but a mirror reflecting our personal evolution. If there's a theme, a question, or a wound you would like us to explore in future videos, leave it below. This space breathes because of you. Your voice is not only welcome here, it is essential. Thank you for showing up, not just to this video, but to your inner work, to the sacred labor of remembering who you truly are. And always remember this, when the right person appears, your soul will know, not through fear, but through peace. But until that moment, let your most intimate relationship be the one you cultivate within. That is the foundation, that is the home. And from that wholeness, all things real are born. Until next time, I'll see you on the path.